From Park Thrillers blog, I'm Sean Smith, and this is National Park Talk. On today's show, we are going to talk about the National Park Service's funding needs. The Park Service, the agency mandated to preserve and protect some of America's most sacred ideas, hopes, and places, is perpetually underfunded. In 2016, the centennial of the birth of the National Park Service idea, stories are once again in the press about the agency's ballooning maintenance backlog, now upwards of $11 billion. How did we get here? What are the ramifications of this funding shortfall, and what can be done? We will answer these questions today on National Park Talk. For those who don't know it, the National Park Service's proposed 2016 budget is a little more than $3 billion. That sounds like a lot of money, but when it's spread over the more than 400 parks, that money comes up short. To put the numbers into perspective, something that people can relate to, Yellowstone National Park, for example, is a park that's bigger than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware combined, but it has a budget of roughly $35 million. This is less than the budget of many small cities. And yet, with these funds, the Park Service is expected to manage wildlife populations, cultural and historic resources, maintain thousands of buildings and hundreds of miles of roads, all while keeping more than 3 million people safe each year. Put another way, more than 300 million people go to the national parks nearly every year. That means the Park Service spends, on average, about $10 per person. It's not a lot of money. Since 2006, the Park Service has seen relatively steady budget increases, from a little more than $2 billion in 2006 to more than $3 billion today. However, when adjusted for inflation, today's budget has roughly the same buying power of the 2006 budget. In other words, the Park Service has gained little ground over the last decade. So how did this happen? And what are the ramifications? The answers to these questions may surprise you, and we'll tackle them right after the break. Back in the last decade, conservation groups, key stakeholders, gateway communities, and others started to recognize the marketing bonanza Park Service Centennial would be. Conservation groups saw the Centennial as an opportunity to get parks more funds in order to improve management, spruce up the parks, and get them ready for their big birthday. Meanwhile, park concessionaires, the people that run the hotels and restaurants, as well as gateway communities, saw the coming Centennial as good for their bottom line. The Centennial meant more visitors, which in turn meant more people staying in their campgrounds, eating in their restaurants, and buying groceries and other things. Forward-thinking people recognized that there was overlap, an agreement in goals between these two groups. It seems everyone loves national parks, and polling seems to support this. And so a conscious decision was made to focus on funding about a decade ago. The theory was that both sides of the aisle could get in support of park funding, that both people on the left and the right of the political spectrum seem to love their parks so much that obviously it makes sense that they'd want to support increasing the funding. As I stated earlier, the Park Service budget around 2006 was a little more than $2 billion. Today, the appropriation is over $3 billion. So it would appear that the effort to focus on funding was successful, that the coalition between conservation groups and business, which set out to see an increase in park budgets, actually achieved their goal. But what was the cost? What was the cost of actually focusing on funding and working to keep this coalition together? Well, in my time in working in Park Service conservation, I found that when a controversial issue, say a proposal to expand a inappropriate use would come up, the effort to put in, the amount of work or time that and the potential political controversy that might be generated had to be weighed against the strain it might place on the coalition to preserve park funding. So, for example, when the NRA a few years back was pushing to expand gun use or the ability to carry concealed weapons into national parks, there was considerable thought and discussion put into how far do we push this? Could we actually defeat the NRA? And if we were to go significantly into this battle, what impact would that have on some of those park friends we had in Congress who might go south on us? If we pushed hard on, say, eliminating guns in national parks, would some of our supporters, say in states like Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, would they no longer support our efforts to increase park funding? Ultimately, the Park Service did finalize regulations to expand concealed weapons use in national parks. It was passed by Congress, a bill that mandated the Park Service to push these new regulations. And unfortunately, and I'm sorry to say, some of the groups I worked for at that time did not press it. They did not challenge this new regulation in the courts. I would have liked to have seen, at a minimum, advocating before a judge, we don't think guns are appropriate. A little aside here, I think the reason the NRA pushed so hard for guns in the national parks, even though there was little public support for it, is that it provided a shining example of where a prohibition on firearms was actually working. Park Service has seen very little crime, and I think the NRA didn't like that. They needed to have that example eliminated, and they spent a lot of time and energy on getting that to happen. And as I said, unfortunately, I think our side didn't do a very good job of fighting that. Even if you lose, I think there is value and honor in putting up a good fight. Now, some of my colleagues will say that we did go forward with press outreach, congressional outreach, but in the end, when it did pass and the regulations were finalized, the matter was dropped. There was no effort made to file it or challenge it in court, and in fact, it just quietly went away. There's been no continual effort since then to introduce legislation to undo these regulations, which obviously could be done. And I believe it's because it would threaten the coalition, the partnership that has been struck with business communities and congressional leaders on the right side of the spectrum who support park funding. And unfortunately, that has come at the cost of the preservation and protection of our national parks. So what do? We're in a situation where conservation groups and key stakeholders have made a deal with the devil. In order to secure more funding, they have at times compromised on park protection. What do we do about it? Well, I think we're partially in a bed that has been made, and we're going to have to continue to stay in it for a while. The Park Service obviously does need funding, and it needs additional funding in order to preserve and protect the places we hold dear. $3 billion is very little funds when compared to against the appropriation, say, the Defense Department gets. And it isn't too much to ask that the Park Service be allocated more money to preserve our most special places like Yellowstone, like Gettysburg, like Katmai. These places are special and have been set aside for a reason, and they deserve appropriate funding. So I would encourage all my listeners to contact their congressional allies and say you support national parks and that they deserve the funding they need in order to protect them. However, if they don't get the funds, I think the Park Service needs to stop feeding the other side, stop feeding congressional detractors who say the Park Service doesn't need the funds. As I said earlier, the Park Service does a great job protecting our parks with very little money. And in fact, as we've seen, the inflation-adjusted dollars, the Park Service is actually doing more with actually the same amount of money they got in 2006. They continue to keep visitor centers open. They continue to pave trails or maintain them and fix potholes. So what they're doing is they're covering up, they're papering over the budget shortfalls and preventing the public from actually seeing what it is they're doing. I say, let's close some of those trails, close some of the visitor centers, really let the public know that you can't manage 400 sites on a shoestring budget. That when cuts are made, when Congress makes decisions, it has real ramifications, real impacts on the ground. And when the Park Service fails to do this, it makes it difficult for the public to actually see what those decisions in Washington are having on the actual management of the parks. I also think the Park Service is going to have to increase fees for national parks. On average, you can get into a park for about $25 to $30 for a week. That breaks down to about $3 a day, $3 or $4 a day. By comparison, going to a park or a place like Disneyland, it's going to run you about $75 to $100 a day just to get in the park. I think that's a pretty good deal, and I think the public rightly would support increasing those fees. Now, we have to be careful in that we don't raise them so much that it becomes a barrier to people with limited income, but I think it can be done in such a way that raising the fees would actually help capture more funds and more support for our national parks. And then finally, I think the conservation community needs to make a decision. Are they in this to preserve and protect parks, or are they in it to preserve and protect the funding for the parks? Now, I recognize this doesn't have to be an either or, but when push comes to shove, I think the protection of the parks should be weighed more than, say, the protection of the funding. Because ultimately, we're not protecting the parks, we're not protecting the funding, we're protecting the parks. And if we don't do that, ultimately, there won't be any need for the funds anyway. The Park Service has to preserve and protect those things at its core which make the places unique. And if by advocating for funds or preserving the park funding mechanisms, we compromise what the parks actually are designed and set up to protect, what have we ultimately done? We have defeated the very purpose for which the parks were established. So, I think for all my listeners, I would encourage you to contact your congressional allies, your congressional representatives, and ask them to increase funding for the parks. But I also would, in the same breath, say they need to recognize that preserving and protecting the parks from inappropriate uses, from activities and things like expansion of high-speed internet actually detract and take away from what the parks actually were set up to do. Thank you for listening. National Park Talk is produced and recorded in Western Washington in the shadow of Mount Rainier. To learn more about National Park Talk, please visit our website at seandavidSmith.blogspot.com or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/parkthrillers. To find us on Twitter, search for @parkthrillers. I'm Sean Smith. Thanks again for listening to National Park Talk.